Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about how to complete homework 8. The first problem talks about some data that is called the Big Mac 2003 data set, and this is a built-in data set in the ALR4 package. And in the first problem we are going to make a scatter plot which has in here, line 31, line 34 is going to use the Big Mac 2003 data set to plot a variable called Big Mac on the vertical axis and a variable called food index on the horizontal axis. And in the processed file you can see what this looks like. Big Mac is the number of minutes of labor that it takes to purchase a Big Mac in various cities around the world. And food index is a variable that measures basically the overall price of food in general in various cities around the world. And in problem 1a, from this scatter plot, I want you to go to the markdown file, line 37, and type out the description of how the food index cost of food variable relates to the price of a Big Mac in terms of minutes of labor that it takes to purchase a Big Mac. In problem part B, we make a regression model that tries to explain Big Mac with food index, and then in line 46 we have a code block that is looking for creating the inverse response plot so that we could determine an appropriate transform of the Big Mac variable. And if you see the display right here in the processed version of the file, you'll see various transforms of Big Mac plotted against each other in the inverse response plot that puts the predicted values of Big Mac on the vertical axis and the actual values of Big Mac on the horizontal axis. And then there are some curves traced out for various transforms of Big Mac. This aqua color means the value of Big Mac is not transformed at all. The dark purple square is a square root transformation. Green is a log transformation. Dark red is a inverse transformation, and the black lambda hat is the lambda that is suggested from the inverse response plot, minimizing the residual sum of squares. And what I'm looking for you to do here is sort of notice what standard kind of transform looks most reasonable compared to, say, the black optimal one. A lot of times we would not claim a negative 0.58 transform as the right transform. We'd pick something close by. And then a little bit later on you will see the box-cox method in the processed file, and from this you get log likelihood and confidence bounds, and you would use those to come up with an estimate of the appropriate lambda transform for Big Mac. So you would use the box-cox tracing and also the inverse response plot tracing to come up with a suggestion using both of the two methods combined, come up with a suggestion for the value of lambda that you would recommend based off of these methods. Keeping in mind that box-cox uses a slightly different emphasis. It emphasizes normality of the residuals, the distribution of the residuals, and the inverse response plot stresses the linearity of the transformed scale. Anyway, in line 57 of the markdown file, please give the value of lambda that you think is appropriate. In part C, we redo the analysis, getting rid of two cities that have very abnormal values for Big Mac, and that is Nairobi and Karachi. And those two cities are taken out of the data set. We make a little data set subset called John, and we're going to use the data subset. And so what we do is we make a revised model with this reduced data subset, model M1, in line 65, and then in line 69 and in line 74 of the markdown file, we repeat the box clocks and the inverse response plots again, and we come up with new revised estimates. And I want you to suggest what lambda is now suggested after we've modified the data set somewhat. And I want you to make a comment about whether the change has been very big or not. And so that's what I'm looking for in line 79 and 81. What transform do you think is suggested in line 79? And then in line 81, talk about whether the change has been very much. In problem 2, we use the same Big Mac data set, and we're going to make a scatterplot matrix of two of the predictor explanatory variables, cost of rice and cost of bread, and then that is in line 91, and you'll see the scatterplot for rice and the scatterplot for bread, and you should notice that the histograms distributions of rice and bread are both very skewed right, and so there might be some transforms to joint normality that would be helpful on these predictors. And so that's what's being done in the markdown file in the code block lines 95 and 96. There is some suggestions about what transforms should be taken for rice and bread. Here are the suggested lambda transforms. And then here is another scatterplot matrix with suggested transforms. You'll notice that they are much more normal bell-shaped distributed, and the scatterplots are more evenly spread as well. So in line 104, you are supposed to tell me about what transforms are suggested for rice and for bread. And you should be able to tell from either the transformed scatterplot matrix or the power transform output about what should be suggested. In part B, you are to test the null hypothesis that the suggested transforms for rice and bread are 1 and 1 for the lambda vector. In other words, don't do anything to the transforms of rice or bread. And you should know enough from the notes to know that that test is carried out in the power transform command output right up here. The power transform command output that's given in the printed file contains the test for the likelihood ratio test for testing lambda transforms of 1 and 1. And so you would use the test statistic and the degrees of freedom and the p-value that are given in the output for that test in part B. In part C, we talk about what transforms are suggested after we take out Karachi and Nairobi again, and look at the lambdas that are suggested and talk about what they suggest and what differences are recommended for rice and bread. And that's what I'm asking you to talk about in part C. In problem 3, we are going to use the Big Mac data set again in a little bit bigger model. We are going to try to predict the cost of a Big Mac with logs of bread, bus fare, teacher's salary, I believe is what that one is, and then the cost of an apartment to the third power. And we are going to do an inverse response plot, and we're going to use the inverse response plot to suggest a transform. And so here is the model that's estimated, model M2, and then here is the inverse response plot, and you'll use that. And remember, black is the optimal suggested one, and so you're looking for a common power that would be nearby to the black one, and suggest that for your power. And that's what I'm asking you to do in line 143 of the markdown file. In problem 4, we are going to talk about some data on strength of wool. It's a built-in data set called wool, and in line 170 we give a scatterplot matrix For the response variable cycles, the number of processing cycles till the yarn breaks. It's a measure of strength. Higher cycles means stronger. And then there are some manufacturing settings called length, amplitude, and load. When you look at the scatter plot matrix of length, amplitude, and load settings against each other, you'll see they're laid out in a rectangular grid pattern in a designed experiment. And then in the top row of the scatter plot matrix, you'll see how length, amplitude, and load relate to our response variable strength or cycles. In part A, we make the length, amplitude, and load variables into factor variables, category variables. I think initially they come in numerically, and we don't really want to treat the numeric values as quantitative variables. We would like to just treat them as settings, and so we make factor variables out of them. In lines 177, 78, and 79, we make a model M1 in line 180, and this model contains some two-way interactions between length, amplitude and load, and length and load, and we print out a summary of model M1, and I want you to look through the estimate summary right here and talk about what kinds of effects are statistically significant. Do we have any kind of relationship between these factors and strength? And if we do, what kind of relationship and the complexity of the relationship do we seem to have? In part B, we're going to estimate a much simpler model that only has length, amplitude, and load in no and no interactions, and we're going to suggest a inverse response plot and look at what transform is suggested by that. And so you'll use and read this graph, and hopefully you'll be able to see what transform is nearby the black curve and suggest that one. And from part C, look at the Box-Cox transform suggestion in this confidence interval. What lambda transform do you think is suggested there? And then in part D, we are going to refit the model with a transform of cycles, a logarithm transform of the response variable, and we print out the summary of that particular model. And what I'm looking for here is for you to look at what effects are significant, what ones are not significant, and in particular pay attention to how much difference there is in the complexity of this model, M1 new, compared to the model we had previously in part A of this problem with all the two-way interactions. And notice that there were a lot of significant two-way interactions up here in this first model where cycles was not transformed with a log transform. But in the model where we do use the log transform of cycles, notice that a lot of these two-way interactions are not significant anymore. And that is a pretty big reduction in complexity, and that's kind of what you're supposed to notice about those two models. And so be prepared to discuss that in one of them the model seems much more complex and hard to interpret and understand than in the other case. As always, let me know when you have questions about the material.